Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a profoundly difficult and really crucial topic, the step-by-step destruction of European Jews during the Holocaust. We've gathered a range of historical sources that, well, they meticulously detail this horrific process. Our mission today is to try and understand its systematic nature, moving beyond just a general awareness to grasp the specific details and the chilling way each stage was connected. This is obviously very sensitive material. Approaching it with care and, a commitment to understanding the historical reality is just paramount. We'll be looking at the progression, starting from the initial discriminatory measures, even how they defined who's Jewish, through to the ghettos, forced labor, expropriation, the mobile killing units, and finally those mass deportations across Europe. Okay, let's get into it. Oh.
Yeah, and it's really important to recognize right from the start that the sources show a very deliberate escalating process. Things that might have looked like isolated actions early on, they were actually integral steps, part of a systematic plan to dismantle Jewish life and ultimately to exterminate them. And the definition of the Jew, as you mentioned, that our sources highlight, that was really the essential first step. It provided the administrative basis for everything that came after.
Absolutely. And it's quite jarring to see how that definition was constructed.
Hmm.
We often think of Judaism in religious terms, right?
Uh-huh.
But the Nazi regime very deliberately pushed it towards our racial definition.
Mhm.
Our sources even mention the kind of historical echo of Martin Luther. His anti-Jewish writings from centuries before were ironically sort of used as groundwork for Nazi propaganda.
Right, providing that imagery.
What's particularly revealing, I think, is that even within the Nazi Party, there were these internal debates about who exactly counted as a Jew. You had figures like Dr. Blum, for instance, arguing against any special status for what they call part Jews.
Yeah, his proposal was pretty extreme. He wanted all quarter Jews considered German, but all half Jews treated as fully Jewish. He had this idea that Jewish genes were, quote, notoriously dominant.
That's all.
It is. And it's crucial to note that while Bloom's radical view eventually became party policy, the legal definitions actually put into practice by the Interior Ministry were a bit different. They were more, well, bureaucratic. They created categories like full Jew, someone with 4 Jewish grandparents, religion didn't matter, and then these distinctions for people of mixed Jewish blood.
A Mischling.
Exactly. A half-Jew, or Mischling of the first degree, that was someone with 2 Jewish grandparents who didn't practice Judaism after a specific date in 1935 and wasn't married to a Jewish person. Then the quarter Jew, Mischling of the second degree, with just 1 Jewish grandparent.
And these distinctions weren't just abstract categories, were they? They were codified in laws like the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor.
Precisely. And they had profound, devastating implications for individuals, for families. So what we're seeing here isn't just, sorting people. It's about constructing this category of other with legal precision.
Which then allows for everything else.
Exactly. It allows for the systematic stripping away of rights and eventually life itself, this bureaucratic act. It was the foundation for the whole machine of destruction.
It's, bureaucratic in its horrifying precision, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this definition then just opened the floodgates for these early discriminatory measures. One of the first really big ones was the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service. That was April 1933.
Very early on.
Right. Signed by Hitler, key ministers.
Yep.
It directly targeted Jewish civil servants, kicking them out of their jobs. And apparently there was already a push against Jewish judges even before the law was formally passed. Provincial ministries were already trying to sideline them.
If you connect that to the bigger picture, you see how the regime was systematically removing Jews from any position of influence or authority. It wasn't just about losing a job. It was about stripping away their rights, their place in German society.
Yeah.
And running parallel to these dismissals was this insidious process they called Aryanization.
The forced transfer of Jewish businesses and property.
Exactly, to non-Jews.
The scale of it is just staggering when you look at the sources. They mention the pressure on prominent families like the Rothschilds.
Right, whose international connections maybe gave them a bit more protection initially.
But even that couldn't hold out forever against that kind of systematic pressure.
No.
We also see examples like the Witkiewicz case in Czechoslovakia. Negotiations were apparently underway to sell to the Czech government.
And then the Germans occupied, and boom, halted. Property seized.
Right. And it wasn't just these huge conglomerates. By late 1938, there was a decree ordering the registration and then the liquidation of all Jewish retail businesses.
Handing them over.
Basically handing them over to German competitors, often for pennies on the dollar.
And it's so important to understand these weren't just random acts of theft. They were legally sanctioned expropriations,
Hmm.
part of a deliberate economic war against the Jewish population.
Yeah.
Things like the flight tax, the Reich flight tax, which kept getting increased.
Making it harder and harder to leave with anything.
Precisely. And the creation of blocked money accounts, the Sperrguthaben, that effectively trapped Jewish assets inside Germany. Immigrants lost control of their wealth.
They were being systematically impoverished, made destitute.
Exactly.
And the dehumanization just kept pace. That blood and honor law. It went beyond just defining who was Jewish. It aimed to prevent any intimate relations between Jews and non-Jews.
Ross and Schande.
Ross and Schande, racial defilement. The penalties were incredibly harsh.
It's chilling.
It really is. And to learn that German men were legally obligated to check their partner's Aryan papers to avoid breaking this law. The sources mention the case of Lehmann Katzenberger, accused of Ross and Schande. It shows the extreme lengths they went to, where even flimsy evidence could lead to severe punishment, even death.
So what does this all mean? It means they weren't just taking away economic power, they were stripping away personal freedoms, dignity, basic human connection.
So the question becomes, how do you control a population you've systematically disenfranchised, demonized, impoverished?
And the answer, as the sources clearly show, was concentration and control. Ghettoization.
Especially in the occupied territories, right? Poland comes up frequently.
Yes, particularly in Poland. Ghettos established in cities like Krakow, Warsaw, Udo. The process involved forced expulsions, often with almost no notice, people crammed into tiny areas.
Leading to extreme overcrowding.
Horrific living conditions. Food was strictly controlled, often near starvation levels. Sickness was rampant typhus, dysentery. Death became just a daily reality.
There's a detail about Krakow, isn't there? After expulsions, they tried to improve housing, but couldn't, because the confiscated Jewish dwellings were already so dilapidated and overcrowded.
Yeah, it underscores the deliberate neglect, the complete disregard for Jewish lives, even before the outright killing started on a mass scale. Establishing these ghettos wasn't just about containment, it was a deliberate strategy. Isolate them, impoverish them further, make them more vulnerable for what was coming next.
And within these desperate conditions, you had the Jewish councils, the Judenrat. This seems like such a complex and tragic aspect.
It really is. Organizations like the Reichsvereinigung in Germany, led by respected figures like Rabbi Leo Baeck, Dr. Otto Hirsch, Director Heinrich Stahl, and similar bodies in the occupied areas, they were forced, in a way, into becoming instruments of German control.
They weren't collaborators in the usual sense, were they? They were Jewish leaders trying to manage an impossible situation.
Exactly, not German puppets. They were trying to maintain some semblance of order, distribute meager resources, maybe protect the community as best they could, but their efforts inadvertently ended up facilitating German directives, from reporting population numbers to eventually, horrifyingly, preparing lists for deportations.
It's a terrible paradox.
Truly. And what's particularly significant from the German perspective was the efficiency the system offered. By using the existing Jewish leadership, they saved German manpower, resources, while still enforcing their policies.
And the exploitation continued inside the ghettos.
Oh, absolutely. Confiscations of anything valuable, furs in winter, musical instruments, radios, and the ruthless exploitation of Jewish forced labor, often for minimal or no pay, working in terrible conditions for German war industries or other projects.
It highlights the complete subjugation.
It does, and what's really chilling is how the system co-opted the victims' own leadership structures. It forced them into these impossible choices, blurring the lines between trying to ensure survival and, well, complicity in the eyes of some later on.
It reveals a really disturbing efficiency in the machinery of oppression, doesn't it? It didn't always need direct German oversight for every detail.
He could leverage existing structures to its own horrific ends.
And then came a horrifying escalation, the mobile killing operations, the Einsatzgruppen.
Yes. Following the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, these units were formed and deployed right behind the front lines.
The sources named the four main groups, A, B, C, and D, and some commanders, like Rasch, Ohlendorf.
Their initial orders were somewhat vague, talking about the elimination of Jews in party and state positions, communists, other undesirables.
But it escalated quickly.
Very quickly. It's crucial to note Heydrich's direct order, which came soon after. Shoot Jews. Men, women, children, no exceptions.
This really represents a shift, doesn't it? From persecution and ghettoization to systematic mass murder.
Absolutely. On an unprecedented scale, carried out face-to-face. The sources give chilling examples. Mass killings in places like Elgin and Cerny in Bessarabia and Bukovina, the horrific massacre in Odessa after the bombing of the Romanian headquarters there, tens of thousands killed in reprisals.
And what about the local populations? How did they react?
It varied enormously. The sources show a disturbing spectrum. In some areas, there was apathy, maybe fear, sometimes reluctance to participate. But in others, particularly where the Germans actively recruited local militias, like in Ukraine, they became active collaborators, sometimes carrying out killings with extreme brutality.
Did the Germans force participation sometimes?
Yes. There are accounts of Germans forcing local Ukrainian men, for example, to witness or even participate in executions to break down their resistance or implicate them.
It forces you to confront that question of individual responsibility within this system, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It wasn't just abstract orders.
Not at all. It involved direct participation, looking victims in the eye, and often a terrifying desensitization seemed to set in among the perpetrators. It highlights how ideology can just warp human empathy on a truly massive scale.
What about the regular German army, the Wehrmacht? Were they involved or aware?
They were definitely aware. While the Einsatzgruppen were SS units, they operated in the army's rear areas. There are instances, mentioned in the sources, of the army documenting SS atrocities.
Out of concern for the victims.
It seems less about that, unfortunately, and more often driven by interagency rivalry or concerns about discipline among their own troops being affected by witnessing such brutality. Halder, the chief of the general staff, has this cryptic diary entry, something like Jewish massacres discipline, which hints at this high-level awareness, but framed as a logistical or morale issue.
So awareness, but not necessarily opposition on moral grounds.
Largely, it seems that way. And despite attempts at secrecy, the sheer scale and, frankly, the personal nature of these killings meant that information spread. Soldiers wrote letters home, word of mouth. Some troops even became morbidly fascinated, taking photos. The horror became almost mundane for some.
And the justification they used, this danger theory.
Yes, that's particularly insidious. They consistently portrayed Jews, even women and children, as an inherent threat, potential partisans or spies, even when there was absolutely no evidence of resistance.
And complete pretext for annihilation.
Exactly. And it's critical to understand that the Einsatzgruppen's targets weren't only civilian Jews. Soviet prisoners of war were also systematically targeted. Those identified as Jewish or as communist officials or just deemed undesirable were pulled out and shot.
Often with Wehrmacht cooperation.
Often, yes. Though sometimes there was friction, like the case mentioned in Vinica, highlighting these complex, often grim interagency dynamics in carrying out these murderous policies.
So as the war went on, this method of shooting, while horrific, maybe wasn't efficient enough for the scale they envisioned.
That seems to be the grim logic. It also took a psychological toll on the shooters. So the regime started seeking more industrialized methods, which leads us to the final stage we need to discuss: the deportations across Europe feeding into the extermination camps.
And the German railway system, the Reichsbahn, play a absolute central role here.
Crucial. It seems almost mundane, doesn't it? A state-owned railway, hundreds of thousands of employees, seemingly non-political.
But it was the logistical backbone.
Completely. Without the Reichsbahn's extensive network and administrative capacity, deporting millions across Europe would have been impossible. Key figures like Staatsekretär Ganzenmüller oversaw this horrific transport system.
And the efficiency is, again, chilling.
It really is. The sources talk about the special trains, the Sonderzüge. They were meticulously organized. They even had specific codes: DA for transports heading out of Germany or Poland, PKR or PJ for transports within Poland and occupied Soviet territories.
And a dedicated group within the railway administration handled it.
Yes, a Sonderze group within the GBL Ost division, responsible for scheduling, allocating carriages. It was all treated as just another complex logistical task.
Carrying people from all over occupied Europe
To their final destinations. Concentration camps, forced labor camps, and increasingly dedicated extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, Bajuric, Sobibor, Treblinka. Theresienstadt is also mentioned as a sort of special case, right?
Yes, a kind of deceptive model ghetto or transit camp, often used for prominent elderly or decorated German Jews, before many were eventually sent on to Auschwitz.
And the process in the cities before deportation, it was brutal.
Yeah, in places like Berlin, Jews were forced into designated Jew houses, making them easier to round up.
The Gestapo used various record census data, Jewish community lists to identify and locate people.
And once deported, they lost everything.
Absolutely everything. Pensions, any insurance payments immediately cut off. Remaining assets, bank accounts confiscated by the state.
The sources even detail finance ministry directives about what to do with the vacated apartments and belongings.
Right down to setting aside better quality furniture for internal government use. It's the banality of evil institutionalized.
When we look at the deportations country by country, you see common threads, but also unique situations. Poland, obviously, was central.
Central, yes. Mass roundups, liquidation of ghettos, but also desperate acts of resistance. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, led by Mordecai Anielewicz, and the UOB is the most famous.
But resistance wasn't always possible on that scale?
Often not. And you also saw conflicting priorities sometimes. Armament officials, particularly later in the war, trying to hold on to skilled Jewish labor in places like the Odu Ghetto or camps in Upper Silesia, clashing with the SS's drive for immediate extermination.
And the human tragedy comes through in small details, like the pleas reported from Zamushich.
Heart-wrenching. "We don't want to die," shouted from the trains.
Looking elsewhere, Norway.
Norway saw collaboration from Quisling's government, but also intervention attempts by Swedish churches. The transport ship Donau became infamous, carrying hundreds to Auschwitz.
The Netherlands.
Tightening restrictions, the forced wearing of the yellow star. Sources mention individual acts of sympathy from Dutch citizens, but organized resistance was difficult. Deportations were systematic.
Belgium, France.
Belgium also saw deportations. In France, you had the early expulsion of Jews from Alsace-Lorraine annexed back to Germany. Then deportations from internment camps like Drancy near Paris, often run with French police assistance initially.
Italy seems different, at least at first.
Initially, yes. Italian authorities and the military were often reluctant to hand over Jews in their occupation zones, sometimes actively hindering German efforts.
But that changed after Italy surrendered and Germany occupied the north.
It did. Transit camps like Fossoli di Carpi were established, and deportations to Auschwitz began. And interestingly, the term ghetto itself originates from the historical Jewish quarter in Venice.
What about the Balkans?
Varied again. Serbia saw early killings by military commanders. Greece, particularly the large Jewish population of Salonika, faced deportations, though there were coordination issues with the Italians initially. Croatia, under the Ustara regime, established its own horrific death camps, like Jasenovac, where hundreds of thousands, mostly Serbs, but also Jews and Roma, were murdered.
Slovakia.
The Slovak government, a German ally, actively participated in deportations, paying Germany to take its Jews. This led to protests from the Vatican and Slovak church officials, which had some temporary effect. The legal definition of Jew was also complex under Slovak law.
Bulgaria is an interesting case, isn't it?
Very. While they imposed harsh laws and deported Jews from territories they occupied, Thrace and Macedonia, the Bulgarian government ultimately refused to deport Jews from Bulgaria proper, apparently due to public pressure, church intervention, and perhaps fear of Allied retribution. Romania had a complex history, with extreme violence like the Iași pogrom early on, carried out by Romanian forces. Deportations happened from various regions, particularly Bessarabia and Bukovina, often to horrific conditions in Transnistria. Figures like Radu Leka were central coordinators.
And finally, Hungary. Very late in the war, but massive deportations.
Extremely rapid and brutal. Hungary had its own long history of anti-Jewish laws, and marking with the yellow star was imposed, though with some exemptions initially. But the mass deportations really kicked off after the German occupation in March 1944. Hundreds of thousands were deported, mainly to Auschwitz, in just a few months, particularly from the province's zone initially.
And Admiral Horthy, the regent, tried to stop them.
He did make attempts later on, under international pressure, to halt the deportations, particularly from Budapest, but largely failed to stop the machinery once it was fully in motion under Eichmann's direction.
And so many of these railway lines, these Sonderzüge from all across Europe, they led to the extermination camps.
Primarily Auschwitz-Birkenau, but also Bizek, Sobibor, Treblinka, Chimno camps, designed or adapted specifically for mass murder.
Auschwitz-Birkenau stands out in the sources, its sheer scale, the use of Zyklon B gas.
It became the ultimate symbol of this industrialized killing process.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, it's just overwhelming to see the interconnectedness of it all.
It really is, from that initial seemingly bureaucratic step of defining the Jew.
Through the legal exclusion, the economic stripping, the physical concentration in ghettos.
The brutal face-to-face killings by the Einsatzgruppen, and then the continent-wide railway-driven deportations to the death factories.
Each step seems like it was a necessary precursor for the next in this systematic process of destruction.
Absolutely. The sources we've looked at reveal this horrifyingly logical progression. a deliberate, meticulously planned annihilation adapted and escalated over time.
Remembering these specific details, the laws, the places, the mechanisms, even the names involved, it feels essential to truly grasp the historical reality. And of course, to honor the memory of the millions who were murdered.
It does, and perhaps this deep dive raises a crucial question for you, the listener, to reflect on. Considering the multitude of actors involved, from the top Nazi leadership down to the local administrators, railway workers, police auxiliaries, collaborators in various countries, ordinary soldiers, what does this reveal about the nature of such large-scale atrocities? What does it tell us about the diffusion of responsibility, the role of institutions, the pressures, and the choices individuals face within such systems? What further questions does this exploration raise for you?